Hi there, friends. I hope that you are doing well, and I hope that you are looking forward to learning how I created this photo, this floating house of cards photo that you voted on. It was a fun photo to create, and it was pretty simple to create, and I'm going to walk you through some tips and some tricks on how you can create a very similar image. So let's get started. So as you can see, the backdrop is pretty simple. And that's one of the things that I wanted to share with you, that you don't need to have a studio or some fancy places that you can shoot. This is literally just in the spare bedroom, the office that I work in. And I just created this sort of backdrop. So it's a bunch of old pages from an old book that I found that was never going to be read. So sorry about any book people that are upset by the pages. The book was already destroyed. There was already pages missing when I found it, so I'm just repurposing it. It's living a great life as a backdrop. Uh, so it's just some cardboard boxes. I put some sort of backing paper, some silver backing paper, gray backing paper, and then just put these pages on. And when you use a really shallow depth of field, it just gives it a little bit more texture. So instead of just using the blank wall there, I created this to give just a little bit more texture so that there's a little bit more interest going on. And that's one thing that you can do to really create some dynamic interest or dynamic backgrounds. It's just adding texture in the background. So you could use pages like this. You could use samples of wallpaper. You could find some old boards or old wood. You could use some wrapping paper. You could use old newspapers. You could use tin foil. You could use lots of different things. So that's one way that you can create a really dynamic kind of background. So whoops. There we go. As you can see, I created this house of cards myself, and as you can also see, it's very unstable. I don't think I'm going to be able to put it back together with one hand, but I just like to create scenes that are simple to put together, and I think that this is one that is pretty simple to put together. It's pretty, you don't need a lot of props. These are just some giant cards that I found at a shop that I've used them multiple times, and yeah, I think the key point in shooting this image was really just getting up close as I could. I used a 50 mm lens, and I set the focus to be right in that center part there. And that really just blurred out the background, and it helped really create that sense of realism. So it really helped me to give a really big sense of scale, made that house of cards look a lot bigger than it was. So that's one other tip I can give to you is when you're shooting the sort of miniature photos, or you're shooting a scene where you want to be immersed into like a bigger object, is to get as close as you can. Use a really low aperture on your lens. So if you have a 50 mm or an 85, try to use kind of the 1.4, 1.8, and get as close as you can. And that's really going to help you build out the scene. So how I did it is I just got as close as I could, and then I just rotated my camera sort of in a clock like this to expand the frame, just making sure that I had shots of all the extra little bits of the background there. All right, so let's talk about the portrait side. So I shot the portrait here in a different room. It's the living room. And I did that because I needed a little bit more space than I could get in the upstairs room. I needed to have a little bit more distance between me and the camera to make sure I was fitting myself in, because I was still going to use the 50 mm lens. Obviously, you can use whatever lens you're comfortable with, but in my case, I needed to use the 50 to match the focal length in the image I was creating. I like to use the same lens for all the components of a shoot when I'm using a 50 mm lens or a 35 mm lens. I don't like to switch between them when I'm shooting. So I needed a little bit more distance between the camera and me, because the lens doesn't fit all of me in it if I'm too close. So I shot the image here in the living room. The lighting is the exact same. So we have a nice big window in the same direction as the window upstairs. So I knew that the light was going to look the same. It was coming from the same direction. It was nice and soft and diffused. It makes it a lot easier to composite when the lighting is the same. So if you can shoot everything in the same light, in the same conditions, in the same direction, it really helps to make your life a lot easier. So I just shot the portrait sitting on this chair, matched the perspectives, kept the angle quite low, and just allowed everything to work quite simply, because the lighting was the same, the perspective was the same, the focal length was the same. Everything was pretty easy to shoot. I don't think I spent more than 5 minutes shooting the portrait side, just because I knew everything was going to match together really well. So let's get into a bit of Photoshop, and I'm going to walk you through some tips and tricks on how to create an underwater scene that looks realistic. All right, so here we have the image, the final image, and I'm going to walk you through some tips and tricks if you are looking to create your own underwater image. The first thing I suggest doing is separating your editing into different components. So I have all the underwater elements in one group called underwater, and that really helps to make sure that you are organized and that everything is falling into the same area. So I have the underwater area, and then I have sort of the above water area, or like the dividing line area, and then I have got like these splashes and the above the water part. So I think it's really helpful to separate your editing or your elements into sections if you are doing a composite like this. It just helps clean up the layers. That makes it look a lot easier. So you can see in the background there's that paper wall, the book page wall that I was telling you about, that helps us to add a little bit of texture, a little bit of interest, a little bit more interesting to look at than just a plain wall. I think it really helps just to add a little bit more interest or texture into the background than if it was just a plain wall. But you could use whatever you wanted. If you have other pieces of texture, you could use a bookshelf, you could use wallpaper, like I said, you could use old wooden boards, whatever you have around you, just to add a little bit more texture. The biggest thing when you are creating an image like this that is half underwater, half above water, is that everything that's under that water line is going to be blurred. So I have just the unblurred version here, and it's just very subtle. I'll zoom in so you can kind of see the difference. But when we zoom in, you can see that we have just the regular image. So you can see it was shot with a really wide aperture. So as it fades off into the background where it's out of focus, it drops quite suddenly. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that everything that's under that waterline is a little bit more blurred. So you can do that in a couple of ways. What I usually do is I duplicate the background, and then I just use the lasso tool, and I kind of just draw a very arbitrary kind of line where I want that waterline to be. It helps just to make it a little bit more fluid, I think, when you do it that way. So you're just sort of drawing an arbitrary waterline. So you want it to be relatively horizontal because water does kind of rest horizontally, but you want to have a little bit of movement too. And once you have that selection, all you need to do is you just need to go in and use your Gaussian blur. So you can just simply go into your filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and you can just blur that just depending on the size or the image that you're working with. You just want to blur that so that it's nice and soft. So you'll start to see that it starts to get a bit softer underneath, and that's going to help make it look a lot more realistic, like it is underwater, just adding that soft blur. You can see the difference it makes when we add in the blur that I've added in. So it's nice and soft underneath that waterline, really helps to make it look like it is underwater. Another key thing to remember when you're adding elements underwater, you can see when I turn this on, is that you need to obviously change the color tone. So water is built up of a few different elements, especially when you're creating an image like this. You want to have lots of different colors of blue, not just one color of blue. So you can see I've added in quite a few. There's this water texture that has some blue into it. So you can see that I added a bit of texture, a bit of depth. You can find these on free stock websites like Unsplash, or you can take your own if you have an underwater camera. But this is just some water texture just to add a little bit more waves and a little bit more kind of natural looking water. I also added in a gradient. So you're just adding in that really subtle gradient, that blue color, really helped to kind of add much more subtle, gradual, from darkest blue to lightest blue from the bottom going to the top. Then I added in some kind of teals and greens in as well. So you can see that we just added in a little bit of teal there, a little bit of green. And I added a bit of teal, trying to add a little bit of teal to like the reflection as well. So trying to add some of that color to the cards and to the under bit of the cards that are holding up the top one, just to add a little bit more reflection of that color back into the cards, because I think that there would be a little bit of reflection. So you can see that underwater it really helps when you build up the layers. So you don't want to have just one color of blue. You don't just want to add one layer of water. You want to build that up slowly. And then also adding in some other small elements like these bubbles, like some little kind of water spray. You could add in other things like fish. In my case, I added in some cards. So I actually added in some cards that were floating. And again, made sure that everything that was under that water line was blurred. So this card is more blurred than this one, but adding in that blur really helps to make it look like it is floating under that water. Like we can't see it because it is blurred out. And on this card, I simply just did the same thing as before. I selected the bottom part of it and blurred it out so that you had a nice sharp edge that was sticking out of the water, and then the rest of it was blurred and underneath all of that textured color. Then just adding in some splashes. I just used some brushes that I had, just adding in those kind of splashes on the bits where there were the cards. So you can see that just adding in those little splashes where the water would hit those cards really helps to just add a little bit more drama, a little bit more interest and texture. And just making sure that you add in some layers of different elements. So like those bubbles, the little water spray, lots of different things that really can help put this together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some of those brushes into a little bundle, and I will give them to use so that you can use them in your own photos to help you make an underwater photo or some splashing photo or whatever you want to create. And then the top is just the adjustments. So you can see that this is what it looked like before the adjustments. It's quite intensely blue, but I just used my usual kind of concoction of adjustments. So some hue and saturation and curves layers, and then of course my color lookup table as well, just to help blend it all in together. And that really does help to tie everything in together. It kind of washes it out a little bit, evens out the color tones, but it helps to kind of bring it all in together so it looks like it fits. Again, I like to shoot, if I'm shooting with a 50mm lens like I did with the background here, I like to shoot the portrait with that as well. I find that it helps keep everything really uniform, helps keep everything really close to the same feel to it, the same focus. Again, shooting from the same light source, so the light was here on the left-hand side, and it was beaming in onto the right hand side for the background and for the portrait, and that helps to tie everything in together as well. I did paint in the shadows just using a brush or a curves layer and a brush, so you can see that without the shadow, with the shadow, just making sure that there's some darker shadows where there would be dark shadows and just fading it out using our curves layer and our nice soft brush. And that's pretty much the basis of how to create this sort of image. So it's just keeping in mind that everything under the waterline is going to be blurred. There's going to be lots of different textures and color tones. So don't worry about just adding one wash of color, one wash of blue. Build it up slowly. Start from the bottom, make it really dark and kind of murky, and then get a bit lighter as you get up to the top. Adding in some reflections, some colors, some splashes and bubbles just to add some texture and some kind of interesting elements. And then just making sure that you have some splashes and some moving elements just to help make it feel more alive. I hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the behind the scenes and how to create an image like this. And if you're interested in using some of those resources, I've included it into the Patreon post. I hope that you enjoyed and have a great day.